The room smelled of rain-soaked timber and time gone stale. Wallpaper peeled from the walls in long, curling tongues, whispering secrets to the floorboards below. The air carried the weight of silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that listens. Outside, a wind moved through the hollow ribs of the old cabin, its sigh threading through cracked window panes, like a mourner caught between prayers. The world beyond was a smear of dusk, bruised purple and grey, where the forest pressed close, watching, waiting. Detective Michael Harrow stood in the center of that ruin, a man whose shadow seemed too heavy for the flickering light. The dust rose in his breath, shimmering like ghosts caught mid-sentence. His flashlight grazed a photograph on the wall, its frame crooked, glass fogged, a young girl, smile fractured by time. He remembered her face before he knew her name. Silence pressed against his eardrums. Somewhere beneath the boards, a drip echoed, deliberate, rhythmic, the pulse of a house that hadn't yet forgotten. He closed his eyes and saw the snow of 2001. The night she vanished, her bicycle half buried near the riverbank, tire tracks dissolving into mist. He'd been a rookie then, all edges and nerves, the case pried from his hands when leads went cold. 24 years later, he was back where it began, called not by duty, but by something older, more treacherous, guilt disguised as purpose. He thought he'd buried this place with her name, but the silence had always known better. Point 2. Old Disappearance resurfaces after discovery of symbolic object. They found it yesterday. A charm bracelet, rusted, delicate as breath. It had surfaced after a storm near Clearwater Creek, tangled in reeds, silver dulled by years of silt and grief. One charm, a small locket shaped like a crescent-moon, had her initials etched inside, L.R. Lydia Rowan. 17. The name settled into Michael's chest like a bruise. He remembered the headlines. Small town girl vanishes. No leads, no trace. She was the sheriff's niece, a quiet honors student who liked to paint the old mill at dusk. They said she disappeared walking home from a school dance. But Michael remembered her differently. Restless eyes, too aware for her age. The kind of girl who noticed ghosts before anyone else did. Now, 2 decades later, her bracelet reappeared in the same place. They'd searched for months. He turned it over in his palm under the forensic tent's harsh light. The moon charm clicked softly, like a heartbeat too weak to finish its sentence. Coincidence? Asked the deputy beside him, though his voice didn't sound convinced. Michael didn't answer. His gaze drifted to the water, where the surface caught the light like broken glass. The creek whispered, a voice that might have been memory or confession. He thought of the night she'd vanished, how he'd been the last to see her walking toward the woods, saying she needed air. He'd let her go, thinking she just wanted to escape the noise. Now the bracelet had returned like a reminder, or perhaps an accusation, and the silence between each drip of water grew longer, sharper, like something was listening from beneath. 3. Investigator shows personal involvement. Mixing duty with obsession, Michael kept the bracelet in his coat pocket, though he knew he shouldn't. It felt like a relic, a tether. Each time his fingers brushed it, the metal seemed warmer, as if carrying her pulse instead of his. He told himself it was for safekeeping, but truth wasn't what it used to be. He stayed late in the precinct, the walls humming with the low fluorescent ache of insomnia. Files from 2001 lay scattered across his desk. Yellowed reports, blurred photographs, witness statements stained by time. Every word seemed to accuse him of something he couldn't name. Her face stared up from the case file, soft smile, wide eyes, a smudge of paint on her cheek. Lydia Rowan, age 17, missing since December 14, 2001. He traced the photo's edge with his thumb until the paper tore, still at it. A voice asked from the doorway, his partner, Ellis. "Just tying loose ends," Michael murmured. "After 24 years." Ellis' chuckle was thin. "Loose ends are all we got left." Michael didn't look up. "Someone wanted this found. Or maybe time did," Ellis said, shrugging. "Either way, it's over. We got the guy." But Michael's silence said otherwise. He didn't believe in time. Not anymore. Only in the weight it left behind. Later that night, he drove back to the cabin. No warrant, no reason. Just the pull of memory. The moon hung low over the tree line, pale and tired, like the charm in his pocket. Inside, the air thickened, and the boards creaked as though recognizing his step. He found himself whispering her name once, twice, not as an investigator, but as someone asking forgiveness, and in the stillness that followed, it felt like she almost answered. Something shifted in him then, a quiet fracture, invisible but deep, and for the first time in years. He wondered if solving her case meant losing himself entirely. They gathered in rooms that smelled of old varnish and the slow grief of photographs. People whose lives had learned to speak in past tense. Each one carried a different shade of winter in their eyes. Sheriff May Rowan moved like a woman who practiced steadiness the way others practiced prayer. Her uniform fit precisely, seems crisp, but her hands could not keep still. The fingers needed invisible threads. She had been Lydia's aunt back when the word meant birthdays, art shows in the school gym. A girl laughing quietly beneath a hand-painted banner. Now the word meant watchfulness. The town had a way of calling her the law, even when they were really asking for absolution. May didn't give absolution. She filed reports. She pressed her mouth thin around the syllables of procedure. Yet when Michael stood across from her, the silence between them filled with the unsaid that he had been there in 2001, that the searchlights had washed their faces the color of chalk, that the river had whispered, "Not yet." Miriam Rowan, Lydia's mother, lived on the edge of town in a house the color of faded lavender. The porch dipped a little under the left step, like a weary curtsy. Miriam had become one of those women the town greeted gently, as if the air around her might shatter. She sold handmade candles that smelled of fir and bergamot, wicks that burned without drawing smoke. She did not attend church anymore. She lit her own small liturgies in the kitchen window every evening and watched the flame, until it trembled into a shape that resembled her daughter's profile. When Michael visited, she made tea and set the cup exactly at the table's scar where Lydia once carved a crescent moon with a butter knife. She marked things, Miriam said, so quietly he almost read it from her lips, so she wouldn't disappear from them. Then there was Ellis, the partner who swore he hated ghosts but kept their hours anyway. A good man, tidy habits, the kind who believed if you stack the files properly, the truth will line up out of pity. He kept photographs of his 2 boys tacked above his desk, faces sunburned and happy at the lake. When the bracelet turned up, he said, "Maybe it's time," in a tone like a door latching. He wanted the universe to be procedural, too. But Michael could tell the case had entered him, the way cold enters the bones. Ellis had started to look at water differently, as if it were an accomplice. There was also Pastor Glenn, a kind-eyed man whose sermons kept close to the earth. He taught Lydia to play piano in the church basement. The keys there were foot-scuffed, chipped at B3, the damp in the walls making everything sound a little underwater. He wore the same wool coat every winter, elbows patched with brown suede, and he carried a peppermint tin that clicked when he walked. "Memory is a room with two doors," he told Michael once, one marked mercy, the other accuracy. You can't stand in the threshold forever. Michael suspected Glenn was really speaking to himself, and Ben Harper, the mill caretaker who lived in a trailer by the river, with hands like the timber he hoisted and eyes that never fully settled. He claimed Lydia painted the mill best when the light was dying, that she could catch the moment it chose shadow over shape. She understood endings, he said, how they stretch before they break. People in town trusted Ben with tools, not with stories. His grief came out slant, like nails driven at odd angles. He brought little offerings to the search sites back then, a wool cap, a thermos of broth. One of her sketches folded into his jacket, as if the place itself could be fed. Their lives braided around the vacancy Lydia left, their words tightening and loosening with the seasons. In each of them, Michael felt a tug that did not belong in casework. Pity, suspicion, the old ache of recognition. He caught himself adjusting his tone with Miriam, as if gentleness could erase negligence. He caught himself watching Ellis for signs of impatience, reading them as betrayal. He caught himself flinching when May said evidence in a certain clipped way, as though the syllables were cuffs. They were not suspects, not precisely. They were weather, a climate of loyalties, rituals, fatigue. When Michael stepped into their rooms, he stepped into the barometric pressure of 24 years. Photographs trembled on thread-thin nails as the front moved through. Voices became wind chimes, soft, disorderly, revealing clefts in the air he hadn't known were there. Every kindness felt like a caution. Every shared memory came bearing a mirror. He knew he was supposed to pass time. He was supposed to reduce. But the case had never been arithmetic. It was a bruise the town moved around. You could locate it only by pressing on what hurt. He knew he was supposed to pass timelines. He was supposed to reduce. But the case had never been arithmetic. It was a bruise the town moved around. You could locate it only by pressing on what hurt. So he pressed, gently, methodically, and a little too long. "You were at the dance?" he asked Pastor Glenn, and the man nodded, peppermint click muted in his pocket. "You walked home that night?" he asked Miriam, though he already knew she had not. "You remember the creek?" he asked Ben Harper, and Ben looked at the water with open dislike. "You were there," May said to Michael, not a question, not an accusation, only weather moving in, and the room felt suddenly smaller, few people, little conversations, but something in the way they turned their faces toward the same corner of air told him, where the vacuum still lived, and where he kept setting his chair. Stubborn, as if a chair could hold space against absence. Their love for the girl weighed as much as their fear of what the love might yet reveal. Michael felt both in his bones. He could no longer tell which belonged to him and which he'd borrowed. That was how obsession entered, not loudly, not with flames, but thread by thread, like ivy finding brick. He woke with their voices in his mouth. He drove the river roads by reflex, windows cracked, letting the cold recite its memorized lines. He thought, with a shame that felt like hunger, if I can carry their grief correctly, perhaps mine will become portable. Some detective work is walking, some is waiting. This felt like kneeling, not to pray, but to fit his ear to the floor, listening for the house's slow, relentless heartbeat. The people in it became joists, beams, weathered studs. If one groaned, he wrote it down. If one held, he leaned harder. And in the quiet between each note, he heard Lydia, or the idea of her, pressing fingertips to the other side of the wall, tracing a crescent that would not resolve into a circle. 5. Symbolic clues, photos. Diary patterns build intellectual intrigue. The evidence did not arrive as answers. It arrived as afterimages, as if Lydia had been painting the town from the inside and the pigments had finally bled through. First, the photographs, an old disposable camera found in a cedar chest at Miriam's, wrapped in a shawl Lydia loved. The roll had been developed in 2002 and never picked up. Somehow paid for in cash. The envelope stamped claim within 90 days. It had slept 2 decades in a drawer merchants stopped opening. Inside, the mill at Blue Hour, windows burnished with that peculiar inland light, and the creek crouched beside it like an animal at rest. In every frame, a crescent appeared somewhere, the curve of a rusted pipe, the shape of a cracked plate, the moon itself caught briefly in the rain barrel. The crescents felt deliberate, as if Lydia had been collecting halves. In one image, a reflection on the water resembled a face, overexposed and faceless at once. Michael traced it with his thumb until the photo blurred, and when it sharpened again, the face seemed closer to his than he wanted to admit. Then the diary, not a diary. Exactly, but a painter's notebook rescued from the school's attic, where the art teacher had stored left-behind supplies. Lydia's name on the inside cover, tucked beneath a sketch of the mill whose lines were so sure they made the paper hum. Notes scrawled in tiny letters walked the edge between poem and map. Edges matter. It's where things agree to be separate. Crescent as promise. The rest is implied. Water keeps secrets because it wants to be everything. If you ask too hard, it chooses sky. He is kind, but kind can be careless. He doesn't know he's being followed by his own shadow. Michael read that last line again, and felt the detachment of his own hands, as if they belonged to a stranger holding a book about his failure. The pronoun could be anyone, he told himself, then felt the heat behind the denial. Lydia's sketches on the adjacent pages showed a figure at the mill's threshold, not fully drawn, just the suggestion of shoulders and a turned head. Above it, she had penciled a crescent, then an arrow pointing not at the figure, but at the negative space beside it. The bracelet's moon charm fit over that penciled crescent, like a missing tooth clicking home. Patterns multiplied. Ellis, who distrusted poetry, started to notice them too. "Look," he said, squinting at a map of the town pinned above the files. Path from the school to the mill. Path from the mill to the creek. The dance to the water. Every route curves. He traced it with a dull pencil. Half circles. No straight lines to the river. May brought a box from evidence. Sealed in 2001 and folded like an apology. A hair ribbon. The missing shoelace. A Polaroid from the dance where confetti resembled tiny moons. In the background, a mirror on the gym wall caught the photographer's shoulder. A cuffed sleeve, the bright click of a bracelet. No time stomp, May said. We were slack then about the small things. She did not look at Michael, and he did not move. The bracelet in his pocket felt heavier, as if it had decided to be a stone. Pastor Glenn produced a hymn book with a corner turned down. On the margin of Abide With Me, Lydia had drawn a field of crescents instead of notes, the staves bending with their weight. She liked to change the music, he said. not the tune. Only the weather around it. Michael ran his finger down the creased paper and heard water instead of organ. A rumor of voices without words. Ben Harper, with his evening whiskey and ruined tenderness, led Michael to the mill's second floor where a scrap of canvas had been nailed behind a beam. Kids, Ben muttered, pride disguised as annoyance. The painting, when they pried it free, showed the mill mouth as an eclipse, black circle swallowing a sky of pale raw linen. But at the rim, another crescent, niffed in, bright as a held breath. Lydia had dragged a dry brush there so the paint whispered like thin grass. In the corner she'd signed her name with a tiny spiral, not a crescent. As if for once she allowed completion. The pile of almost messages began to reorder Michael's thinking. He pinned the photos in a row and stood back. He copied the notebook lines into a separate page and drew arrows until the page became a web. The crescents felt like instructions for reading negative space. Look at what isn't there. What refuses to be whole, and when he applied the method to the statements from 2001, something shifted. The spaces between testimonies started to speak louder than the words. I saw her leave the gym around 10, said a classmate, but omitted who she had been watching when she said it. We checked the West Bank first, said a deputy, and Michael heard we did not check the East in time. Pastor Glenn offered rides, said May's notes, and underneath, in a different hand, declined. The word declined angled inward, as if ashamed of itself. He knew his own statement too. I saw her go toward the woods. The space around it thrummed with everything he did not write. I did not ask why. I did not follow. I let the night have her because I mistook the night for air. Every clue pointed outward and then curved back. Every crescent ended where it began, refusing wholeness. Michael realized he had organized the case as a circle because he was afraid of doors. If he were honest, if he followed Lydia's instruction, to attend the negative space, the circle was a trap. He'd built to keep from seeing the line that led directly from her to him. The intellectual intrigue was not the pleasure of patterns solved. It was the ache of pattern recognized too late. He found himself whispering to the photographs, "Forgive me," in the worry quiet of the precinct. The copier light panned across the images like a slow lighthouse beam, and for a second he thought he saw a figure move between frames. He blinked, and it was gone. He wrote in the margin, "Perception is a witness, unreliable, armed with love, 6, twist, questions investigators' perception." Blurring truth and delusion, the arrest came like thunder after an afternoon that had forgotten it could storm. A DNA touch on the locket's hinge, degraded but serviceable. A partial match that tugged a thread none of them expected. Not a drifter. Not Ben. Not the faceless myth towns prefer because myths cannot sue. It was Pastor Glenn. The community staggered. The peppermint tin on his desk became a rattle in memory. The wool coat's elbow patches turned sinister overnight. Parishioners spoke to cameras with voices that tried to be both firm and fair. May read the affidavit without tremor, but a vein in her neck pulsed like a metronome. Ellis boxed the files with a relieved efficiency that nearly broke Michael's heart. Sometimes, Ellis said, the simplest story took 24 years to arrive. He meant well. He wanted the weather to clear. Michael did not feel the air lighten. He felt it tilt. He watched Glenn in interrogation, the man's hands open on the table as if he'd come to bless it. "I did not harm her," he said, and the words were nearly gentle. "But I failed her." He kept his eyes on an invisible middle distance. "I failed many. The Dar, hungry for sound bites, translated failed into legal language. The town translated it into betrayal. The delicate science whispered trace transfer, the way objects tell each other stories in the dark. The newspapers wrote the arrest in a font that loved endings. Michael returned to the cabin and found his shadow waiting on the wall, larger than it had any right to be. He set the bracelet on the windowsill and listened to the creek recite its long sentence. The photographs were spread on the floor like fallen leaves. In the corner, the painting of the mill leaned, eclipse rim glimmering. He closed his eyes and the room kept moving. Memory is a room with two doors, the pastor had said. Michael tried mercy. The door opened onto a scene he could almost bear. A kind man overburdened, a town eager to deposit its dread into a single pair of hands. He tried accuracy. The door opened onto the gym's mirror, catching a cuffed sleeve and a bracelet glint. His bracelet, not hers. A detail May had not said aloud, but he could feel as if the metal were hot against his skin. The bracelet he had taken from evidence for safekeeping. The one warming in his coat pocket whenever his guilt needed a pilot light. In the Polaroid's blurred shine, the cuff was turned up the way he wears it when he forgets himself. The shape of a shoulder could be anyone's, but he read it as his. He could not unread it. He remembered the dance's music, a slow song with the tempo of snowfall. He remembered stepping outside for air, how Lydia had been already there, her breath clouding, her cheeks bright with paint from the banner she'd touched as she left. "You okay?" he had asked, and the words came out too large, clumsy enough to make her laugh. "You look like you want to be rescued from something that isn't happening," she had said. Not unkind. "Then, I'm fine." A beat. "You're kind." But kind can be careless. He had watched her walk toward the trees. He had not followed because he feared confusing concern with control, because he feared what the creek might make of him. The twist wasn't that. Glenn might be innocent or guilty in a way that could be prosecuted. The twist was that Michael's vision had arranged the world to keep him intact. He had curated his memories until they became a crescent, lit where it flattered him, dark where it made him flinch. He had pursued patterns that absolved him. He had kept the bracelet because part of him wanted to claim caretaking as penance. He had heard Lydia's voice because conscience speaks in familiar tones. He drove to Miriam's, the lavender house, damp around the edges from a week of rain. He returned the bracelet. He opened his hand, and the moon lay there like a coin someone forgot to spend. Miriam took it with a tenderness that made him want to confess. "We have an arrest," he said, and the sentence felt both true and wrong. Miriam nodded, eyes on the charm. "Do you?" she asked, and there was no sarcasm in it. Only a tired kind of clarity. At night he dreamt the creek rose to the cabin's windows and looked in. Its surface was a mirror until it wasn't. In the glass, he saw himself questioning Glenn in the room he'd known too well. He saw himself misreading a nod, mistaking weariness for admission, mapping a narrative onto a man who had merely stood too near the town's sorrow for too long. He woke, heart punishing his ribs, convinced that truth in this case would never be factual enough to set anyone free. When May called in the morning, "We have to move fast on the arraignment," he almost said, "I'm the one you want," though he knew that wasn't law and perhaps not literal truth. He meant something smaller and larger. "I'm the one who let the night have her. I'm the one who built a circle and called it closure. I'm the one who took the charm and mistook possession for care." He said instead, "I'll be there," and listened to the line die. A clean little death in the precinct's fluorescent hush. the evidence boxes stacked like muted tombstones. Michael stood very still. He understood that his obsession had been not with Lydia, but with a version of himself he could survive. The investigation had become a mirror maze. Every clue he found exposed a flaw, and the more he corrected the angle, the more the flaw multiplied. Arrests might satisfy statutes. Confessions might fill columns. But perception had a way of eating its young. He went to the river one last time before court. The morning light, the color of old pewter. He watched a crescent of foam snag against a root and then slip free. The water said nothing, as usual. It did not supply epiphany. It carried its own unfinished sentence downstream, taking with it the pieces Michael kept trying to name. He stood there longer than was reasonable, letting the cold say what language could not. When he finally turned back, he walked a different path to the road, a straight one, for once, and found it no easier. 7. Ending feels haunting and unresolved. Truth brings no peace. The courthouse echoed like a nave emptied in a hurry. Steps rang, halted, rang again. People spoke in careful measures, honoring the ceremony by pretending they believed in its mercy. Glenn stood with his attorney, chin level, hands folded as if expecting a hymn. May's jaw was set to the business of daylight. Ellis looked relieved in a way that made him smaller, as if relief were a coat 2 sizes too big. The hearing was procedural and yet not. Words traveled, were captured by microphones, translated into transcript. The locket's hinge was discussed as if it could take an oath. The mill was spoken of in past perfect, the creek as if it had entered a registry. Miriam sat in the back, palms nested around the bracelet, the little moon resting in her lifeline like an old promise. She glanced at Michael once, not accusing, not forgiving, only seeing. He felt both recognized and erased. When the judge set dates and the attorneys collected their folders, the room let out the breath it had been holding. Reporters spoke into cameras. Headline writers reached for verbs with appetite. Arrest shocks community. Shock is a story that sells. It's also a circuit that burns and then resets. Leaving the house structurally unchanged, Michael walked outside, and the November light surprised him by being beautiful. It laced the courthouse columns, leaned against the parked cars, made a bleak music of the bare trees. He realized beauty and sorrow were old neighbors who politely borrowed sugar. He stood on the steps longer than he needed to, feeling the cool stone seep into his shoes. When Ellis clapped his shoulder and said, "We did good," Michael almost believed him. He nodded, because a nod can mean, "I heard you," without meaning agreement. Later. Alone in the cabin, he opened Lydia's notebook to the page with the penciled crescent and read her lines again. Edges matter. It's where things agree to be separate. He tried to decide which edges mattered now. The edge between law and conscience, between memory and invention, between kindness and the vanity of rescuers. He could not get the edges to hold still. The room smelled of wet wood and something sweet like an orange peeled many winters ago. He placed the notebook beneath the second-floor painting, aligning the crescent rim with the penciled arc, and for a second, a brief trembling second, they formed a near circle. He felt relief bloom in him like a forbidden spring. Then the air shifted, the paper breathed, and the gap returned. That gap would be his weather now. The case, officially, was solved enough to be prosecuted. The town would learn to arrange its evenings around the new story. Sermons would address it bravely. Guilt would continue to glint on wrists and in memory. The creek would remember nothing, as was its habit. May would sleep for a night and then wake to a fresh inventory. Ellis would take his boys to the lake and let them throw stones from the dock. And the joy would be real. Michael would carry the other version, the one where he wasn't fast enough, attentive enough, humble enough to follow a girl who asked for air and deserved a shadow willing to be mistaken. He would carry the bracelet's residual warmth in his palm long after returning it, the way an object imprints its absence. He would carry Glenn's open hands on that metal table, a posture that might mean innocence, or might mean a surrender that language cannot appraise. He would carry the sight of Miriam's eyes on the charm, not looking at him, looking through him toward a place where daughters and mothers speak in a grammar the living cannot pass. At night he walked the river path and counted crescents, the peeling paint on a rail, a smile left on a bottle's lip, a street lamp's halo broken by pine. He told himself he was not looking for Lydia, that a look would be theft. He was learning, late, to be the kind of man who keeps his hands open. In the dark, open hands resemble mercy if you squint. They also resemble surrender. He dreamed again of the room with two doors. He stood in the threshold, one hand on each knob, and understood that the handles turned the same way. He could enter either and arrive in the same place, a quiet where the case was over and the harm could not be undone. In the dream, he sat down between the doors and waited for the house to choose him. It did not. Houses are not arbiters. They are witnesses who will not swear. On a morning when frost spidered the cabin window and the creek stood briefly in its skin, Michael wrote a letter he would not send. Lydia, he began, and then stopped, because names deserve ceremony. He tried again. I saw you. Not enough. He signed it with nothing. He slid the page into the notebook and closed it, letting paper hold what he could not when he turned out the light. The room became a familiar kind of dark, not the hospitable dark of sleep, but the honest kind that keeps you company. The cabin breathed, the floorboards ticked. Far off, a siren unspooled and thinned. He thought of the mill's eclipse and the bright rim that refused completion. A promise that the world is most truthful where it does not quite meet. He slept, finally, because the body insists. The case, for the world, would proceed along its rails. Testimony would be given. Experts would pronounce. A verdict would arrive, dressed in clean clothes. The community would gasp and then adjust. But inside the life where Michael lived, a different judgment had already been rendered, one without audience, without appeal. See,